Thank you for taking your time off for this book discussion organized by Ananta Aspen Center. And the book is Looking Ahead, India and Singapore in the New Millennium, celebrating 50 years of diplomatic relations between India and Singapore. We have a very distinguished panel here to discuss the book. And it so happens that each of them has contributed a chapter to the book. Before we get into our panelists to say a few words on how they look at the India-Singapore relations going forward, maybe the next 50 years, I thought it would be appropriate for me to talk about the book so that the discussion is set in the right context, in the proper background. There are 19 essays in this book. There are eminent contributors from both the countries. 6 broad categories under which the essays have been divided. We have strategic issues, we have economic issues, and lest anybody criticizes the editors of the book that we have looked at the business side, there is a business section also. Innovation has a section which got 3 or 4 chapters. Then you are looking at partnership as a concept, partnership not just between businesses but also between countries. Then of course the obvious thing of culture, which really underpins the relationship between the two countries. 10 contributors from Singapore in this book and 9 contributors from India. And one significant element or a common factor that you will see if you get to look at the book is that many of the contributors have directly played a role in developing diplomatic relations between India and Singapore. Thus, a ringside view of this evolution of this relationship can be expected from the book and these many chapters. And true to its spirit of a kind of a bilateral effort, even the editors of the book, one from India and one from Singapore. So therefore, it is not improper for me to say that nothing could be more reflective of the collaborative nature of the exercise in bringing out a book of this type, celebrating 50 years of diplomatic relations between India and Singapore. So I thought for convenience sake, I would like, and I'm doing it for sake of brevity, so forgive me if I exclude some names. So I thought of summarizing the book in terms of 10 key takeaways, and I will list them all. Point number 1 is the point is the real warming up of relations between the two countries actually had to wait till the end of the Cold War. And this is what C. Chok Moon in his essay points out. And C. Chok Moon, those of you who are not aware, is the architect of India's Comprehensive Economic Cooperation Agreement in 2005. In a similar vein, Ambassador Tommy Koo also makes a point, and he expands on this theme and underlines the importance of the durability of these relations. Point number 2, the business view is very interesting. As Ambassador Gopinath Pillai and Satpal Khattar point out, India's opening up in the 1990s actually benefited Singapore, and yet the nature of this opening up threw up new challenges for this relationship. So it's in the same, the 2 essays by Mr. Gopinath Pillai and Satpal Khattar actually bring out this dichotomy of sorts, that how it is the reforms initiative in 1991 that actually helped the relationship to grow roots, and yet the nature of that reform process actually threw up new challenges. The third point is the Singapore's educationists S. Gopinathan and N. Varaprasad they point out how apprehensions are quite obvious in the manner in which India's demographic dividend can actually be an unemployment curse if necessary adequate attention is not paid to skills and, most importantly, productivity enhancement efforts. I think it's a warning worth taking note of, and that is point number 3. The fourth issue was pointed out by Mr. Das is here, and he talks about the strong ties and complementarities, and he actually takes the debate to a different level, and he says that, if I understood you correctly, Mr. Das, that the relationship can actually realize its true potential if this is escalated to a Prime Minister's level summit, an annual event, and then only it can actually take the relationship to a level which is durable and more rewarding. Going to the fifth point, it is Jamshed Godrej. He talks about the need for industry level cooperation and not just restricting the relationship to government. And unless there is proper business to business ties, apart from people to people cooperation, the efforts to bring the governments together would have limited results. I think it's a fair warning. And going to the sixth takeaway, it is coming from Arunabha Ghosh and Karthik Ganeshan, who say that there is need for a joint task force between India's Department of Industrial Policy and Promotion and Singapore's Economic Development Board. And his second point, equally interesting, he makes, the two authors make, is that there is need for a Singapore-India entrepreneurship incubator to identify areas where industry level ties could get stronger. So in a sense, that what Jamshed Godrej talks about is actually is given a theoretical support and institutional answer. S. Ramadorai makes the valid point that an agile and data-driven decision-making system alone can help boost innovation. This is even more relevant today with technological progress taking place at an even faster pace. And a similar point is made by Dilip Chenoy on the need for securing private sector participation on skills development. The eighth point comes from Ambassador Shamsaran, sitting next to me, and he points to the stark asymmetry between India and Singapore in every respect. If you're looking at the size, looking at the stage of development and everything. And yet, this relationship has acquired a strategic salience in the context of the complex regional balance of power. And to look at this relationship from that perspective makes us wonder that which way this relationship can prosper and how the potential, the complementarities or the synergies can be exploited. The ninth point worth recounting here would be the importance of trade and cultural links, and they are underlined by T.S. Vishwanath and Shashi Tharoor. Pramit Pal Chaudhary also adds and expands this point by noting that sufficient understanding and sensitivity need to be developed to recognize the character of Indian migration to Singapore, and I think it's a very important point, that nurture the strength for bringing the two countries closer. Finally, C. Raja Mohan, in a short essay, makes no bones about the onus on India's policymakers. He argues India must close the gap between its regional promise and performance by accelerating economic reforms, modernizing its physical connectivity with the region, and lending greater vigor to its military and security partnership. I will end here, but the themes are pretty common: private sector role, government initiative, strategic vision, use of technology, stress on productivity, need for durable institutions to forge this relationship. Yet these are points that need to be stressed if we have to take this relationship forward. May I now request Ambassador Saran to kick it off and maybe make brief observations about what he thought of his contribution and how he sees the Singapore-India relations going forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Bhattacharya, for a very good summation of the contents of this very interesting volume that has been put together to mark the 50th anniversary of India-Singapore diplomatic relations. A book which is important because various people from different walks of life, different segments of society, from their particular perspective have focused attention on the trajectory of India-Singapore relations over the last several years, and have given also their perspective on how they see the relationship developing in the future. So we have a variety of perspectives, both on the present as well as on the future. And I think there is, for policymakers, I would hope that there is enough material in this book to really pick out some key areas where we should be really focusing on for the future. As you have said, the contents of this book reflect how wide-ranging the relationship is. And I myself in my chapter have pointed out in a sense, a certain unique character of the relationship, because on the one side you have basically a city-state, and on the other side you have a massive, almost a continental size country with a population which is several multiples, thousands of multiples of what Singapore's is, area which is also in multiples. And yet there is a certain symbiotic relationship which seems to have developed over the last several years. I think the most important role that Singapore has really performed for India, and this may seem a little contradictory because part of the reason why Singapore is so important for India is precisely because India is inefficient.
Yeah.
Because India has not yet, or its reforms have not yet, in fact, yielded the kind of very competitive, very efficient economic processes and governance so far, which is why Singapore has become a platform of choice for companies in India to do business in the region, for financial transactions, and for encouraging inward investment into India. And were India to become very competitive and efficient, perhaps that role of Singapore would decline and we would have to look for fresh avenues to really develop the relationship. But I think for the present, and as far as I can see in the near future, this role that Singapore has been performing as a kind of a offshore platform for India, this role is very important and is likely to continue. The other aspect of the relationship between India and Singapore, and which I have touched upon in the chapter that I have written, is quite obviously the geopolitical dimension to these relations. And there I think perhaps it might be worthwhile looking at how these relations may develop in the future. There is no doubt in my mind that for a country like Singapore, which in fact prides itself in saying, look, we don't have ambitions to go around, shaping the region or shaping the world, but we take the world as it is and see what are the ways in which Singapore can navigate through what is a very complex and changing landscape, and benefit Singapore from whatever the situation that has come about. But I think going forward, perhaps it may not be so simple to my mind, because a certain kind of landscape has survived in the Asia-Pacific region, where Singapore is located in a very, very strategic position for quite some time. I mean, there has been basically an American security guarantee for the region, which has suited Singapore eminently, while it has pursued its relationship, for example, with China. Once this particular predictability in the geopolitical situation has started changing, I think Singapore is today not quite clear as to which way it should be heading, because it looked upon India, and the economic aspect comes in here, it looked upon India as providing some degree of balance to the region at a time of relative decline in US presence, relative decline or some uncertainty with regard to the US security guarantee for the region. India has not quite lived up to that promise. This is quite clear. So many people, I remember 10 years ago, there was a phrase that India and China are two wings of the aeroplane, which will make Singapore fly. You know, those two wings are very important. It would be fair to say that one wing seems to be performing somewhat better than the other wing. So the aspect of maintaining a degree of balance in the region, which gives Singapore the space to pursue its economic ambitions, its maintaining its independence, which it has done so well. I think we are coming to a point where I have a sense, and this I see from my several visits to Singapore over the last few years, my sense is that in Singapore there is a feeling of a narrowing of space for Singapore as we go forward. China is an opportunity, no doubt about that. But at the same time, the dominance of China in the economic field, and today with the South China Sea dispute, the likelihood of a Chinese dominance in the security field, I think does create discomfort for Singapore. Now, this creates a situation potentially for India to play an important role. Because I do believe that if there is one country in the region which has the capacity, which has the potential to really emerge as a credible countervailing presence, not in terms of containment of China, but in terms of providing the countries in the region a certain degree of space in which there is a degree of comfort, I think it is only India. And how this will play itself in the future, I think still remains unpredictable. Lastly, I would like to end on a positive note, because I think the record of Singapore has been a very impressive part of Singapore's record has been its ability to reinvent itself as the situation in the region, as technology, as economic processes have actually been changing. It has been remarkably successful in doing that, starting from focusing attention on labor-intensive manufacture to now being a very, very productive, highly efficient service economy, but also going in for some very selected high-tech areas where its focus would be. This is something quite incredible for a city-state like Singapore. I was very impressed by the fact that Singapore, which has a very small area, is literally building a underground Singapore. This is something which is amazing, how Singapore has been able to do this, becoming a very major logistics center for the entire region and even the world. Today, many people don't realize that Singapore, for example, is one of the most important storage for high-value art, which Geneva used to be and continues to be for some time. So there is a constant search for what could be the next big thing and stay ahead of the curve. And this is, I think, a quality which I would hope that India can also imbibe, because in a very rapidly transforming world, the ability to be nimble, the ability to stay ahead of the curve is something which is really quite remarkable. So I said there is a certain degree of unpredictability with respect to the geopolitical situation, but the record of Singapore in terms of staying ahead of the curve gives me the sense that Singapore will actually navigate this challenge quite successfully as well, given its past record. And therefore, the opportunities for India to continue to work together with Singapore, to expand the relationship with Singapore. I think, as I have said in my chapter, the best days may be yet to come. Thank you for your attention.
Okay. Thank you, Ambassador Saran. Mr. Das, you have looked at this relationship from a vantage point of industry and government relations, and over the last many years. How do you see this relationship going forward, and what are the fault lines, if there are any?
My love affair with Singapore is nearly 23 years old.
Yeah, that's right.
Started in September 1993. It's not. It's kind of institutionalized. And I was privileged to write in this book which you edited, and thank you for giving me that opportunity. One point of history then. I think encouraged by our Prime Minister's office in 1993, we took 18 CEOs to Singapore for the very first time. A high-level business delegation had never been. We had kind of just ignored Singapore to our cost, I think. We went there, and that day, on 28th September, we spent in 2 installments, 4.5 hours with the Prime Minister of Singapore, where he talked at the end of starting India-Singapore fever. And the amount of time he spent with us to understand India, actually he was doing a lot of his homework there. And he brought in Singaporean CEOs at short notice. I want to give you this because it's the image of the day, It started the ball rolling. And why I say we were encouraged by the Prime Minister's office, because at that time the Principal Secretary, who may not have explained anything about what they were planning in the future to us, but said, "Tum jao na, you go there. We'd like you to go there and see." Because 1 year later the Prime Minister went there and he gave his famous Look East policy speech in the Singapore lecture. Exactly September 1994, 1 year later. He went to Vietnam and Singapore, we accompanied him. And again encouraged by the government, we opened CII's Singapore office in Singapore, inaugurated during the Prime Minister's visit, and that office continues till then. The other thing that happened then, thanks to the encouragement from both governments and their leadership, was that CII set up a core group for Singapore, which till today goes every year to Singapore and interacts with the government and business leadership of Singapore and reviews progress, takes stock, and plans for the future. It's like a industry level institutional arrangement, but in partnership with the Singapore government and Singapore business. So this is just going back to where it started, and we went through many ups and downs. The India fever, we got 100 degrees and went down to 96 degrees and all of that, and there were disappointments, etc. But I think the relationship flowered over time. And I think just to add to what Shyam said, just one point is, I think over time Singapore became central to our Southeast Asian, and actually it spread to the East Asian, that whole Asian strategy, that part east of India. I think Singapore had a centrality in its role for us. And I think we always felt, and I think we still feel, that Singapore has been our best friend in that region. And when we were having difficulties in interacting with the ASEAN on many things, I mean, Singapore was helping us to bridge the gap between different points of view in the ASEAN and India. So my paper in the book, I'm very fond of the letters of the alphabet.
Yeah,
there are 26. There are 26 letters in the alphabet, and I have set out 26 agendas for India and Singapore together. Because I see for every letter of the alphabet, there is mutual benefit and mutual advantage to be gained by working in between the two of us. So let me go to my third point, which is the economic part of that forward agenda. We are very proud of the fact that we have a comprehensive economic cooperation agreement with Singapore. But I am very disappointed that we have not gone beyond base one. You know, we did SICA, but we were to review it. There were differences between us, and we have not resolved those and moved on to SICA 2. I would have liked to see SICA 2, SICA 3 happening. You know, so which means a deepening of the economic relationship through a framework agreement. And one big agenda for us going forward is SICA 2 and SICA 3. This must happen, and I can only feel that there are two reasons for it. One is business on both sides is not pushing enough, or sometimes business on one or both sides is actually wanting to retract. You know, there is this, when you are in pain, when you are not having enough growth, then you don't want to promote free trade agreements. You want to restrict the access to markets. Right? So I think there is a bit of that. We must get over this with Singapore. Two of us must get together with strong political will. Big things are being done, you know, by India today, internationally. And I think with this SICA roadblock, I'm looking at the High Commissioner, but he's not to blame. This SICA roadblock we must get over. So this is a big one. The second one is the India-ASEAN relationship, which I referred to, where Singapore has been a bridge and a facilitator. I think we again need to deepen this. Our trade agreements and all are at a very low level of market access. I think we have to go beyond that. We want to get integrated. The market of India and the market of ASEAN must get integrated in the future. So this is a big economic agenda which I see ahead. We are accessing FDI and FII from Singapore and through Singapore. It's not necessarily always originating there. But there are two companies in Singapore who have now become, they're government companies who are major investors in India, Temasek and GIC, the Government Investment Corporation. And I think it's a reflection of their confidence in India that they are putting more and more money. But I think this can be taken further. I think we need to actually have a strategy and an engagement, a dialogue. When I was there, the CII, we used to go and make sure we met Temasek CEO and chairman, we met GIC and gave them an update on the Indian economic situation. I don't know whether that's still being done. They have, of course, many sources of information. India is an open society, but I think they need to be engaged because they have huge funds at their disposal, and I would like to see them seeing India as their number one priority attention. I don't think we have still got to that level in their investment strategy and their investment priorities. We've already talked about technology, innovation, entrepreneurship, and also I won't go there. Singapore is the easiest place to do business in. We are talking about ease of doing business in India. We just have to go to the Singapore government the website and copy everything and do it, and we will go from number 102 to number 2 or something like that. You know, I think they are 1 or 2 or 3 or something. You know, if you want to do ease of doing business, everything is online, everything is transparent, everything is decisive. You can register a company in the same day in Singapore, the same day that you apply. So I think this is huge benefit for us in working with Singapore. And by the way, in this area and in all other areas like building state capitals or urban development, Singapore is a model to learn from. So it's the relationship can go beyond the center to state level across the country for all the states who want to be investor friendly, want higher economic growth and all of that. I want to turn to the non-economic side, because I think that is, all the corporate muscle makes sure that the economic side gets attention or it gets put down, when you are in pain. But the non-economic side is not getting enough attention. Singapore has amazing work ethics. Word productivity has been used, rightly. Where does it come from? It comes from work ethic. It comes from discipline. Dr. Kalam used to say that, why don't you behave in India the way you behave abroad? And very often you refer to Singapore as an example, because it was a role model. I think work ethics, discipline, even the concept of national service in some form, it's an integrated thing. We need to look at this and learn how do we emulate and improve, because we are in a mess in those areas. Integrated living. They have Chinese, they have Indians, they have Malays, they have different communities, but they're all living together. There are no ghettos. This is planned integration. It's a worry for us, what is happening here. So, small country, amazing strategy, plan, implementation on housing and integration of communities. Raja has lived there, and maybe he can verify this. It is something for us to learn from and talk to them quietly. We don't have to, this is not for big agreements, but quiet conversation of how do you do it? And we can do it if we learn from a small country like Singapore. Safety and security. There are people sitting in this room, there are so many others who are happy to take their wives, their children and settle in Singapore. Why? Children are safe there. Women are safe there. It's a great place to live in. You don't worry about anything, even late at night. Something to learn, something to collaborate on, something to learn from. So I see many things, including, with all due apologies to foreign think tanks, Singapore has developed indigenous think tanks. The Lee Kuan Yew Public Policy Institute, the Institute of South Asian Studies, the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, and so forth. I mean, there are other, the Institute of Policy Studies. They have developed their own think tanks. So, fine, Brookings has come, Carnegie has come, all of that's fine. But what are we doing more to develop powerful think tanks led by outstanding intellectuals who will contribute to our our own thinking and status in the world. So Singapore is strong in institutions, therefore. So I've covered that, as one of the points, because we are not getting that kind of strength in institution building that we should be doing. So like this, there are many other points. As I said, it's A to Z. I've given an agenda. I think there is a lot to do. I think the non-economic side needs attention also, which we are, I think it's getting lost somewhere. It doesn't figure into, it doesn't kind of fit into agreements and MOUs and things like that. And of course, we should not depend, with Singapore, we don't have to be only government doing. It can't be, need not be G to G only. It can be B to B. It can be I to I, institution to institution, So there are different levels of cooperation that we can have with Singapore, and different institutions and society can be involved in that. Every time we go to Singapore, Tommy Koh makes sure that we go to a museum. The museums are magnificent. There's so much to learn from how they have built up their museums, how they have modernized them. Again, an area for collaboration in the field of art and culture. So I just see this country as an amazing country to work with, and I haven't mentioned skills or education or healthcare or other areas, but some kind of, I wrote in my paper about this annual summit. I get a sense that something like that is on the way now as a kind of thing, but I don't know. Sanjay will know better than this. I think there was no annual summit. They met from time to time, but I remember meetings at the summit level used to get put off. You know, it was, dates were never convenient. It was not, you know, we had to meet in November or October or whatever in each other's countries. That was not there with Singapore. I think that needs to be there. And I think we must give that priority because we have a lot to benefit. I'm sure they will also benefit. It is not one-way traffic at all. Of course they will benefit. And Shyam says, Go Chok Tong used to tell us from 93 onwards, this two-wing concept, you know, one wing is China, one wing is India, and we need to fly with both wings, balancing us, you know, and we will fly with both of you. And he really kept the faith in India all through that time. So we need to give more attention, even though we are 1 billion people and there are maybe 5 million people, but there's an amazing country. And as I say, I've always been in love with Singapore. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Rajamohan, your perspective.
Yeah, thank you. I think we've covered quite a bit of ground already. I really want to begin by saying how privileged I was to be part of this project because I'm among those thousands of new Indians who are now linked to Singapore. I lived there over the last 10 years. I lived there for 3 years. The next 4 years, I had every quarter I was a visiting fellow, in one of the universities. And now it's less, but a visiting affiliation that I still have. And I'm not just the only one. You take any flight, you see people from Delhi, Bombay, Chennai, Calcutta, the middle class of India today, connecting to Singapore, I think, in an extraordinary way. And I think this is a whole new generation that is going to see Singapore as very much a part of, I don't want to use this word Greater India, but of Singapore.
Little India.
Of Singapore actually being in many ways connected to India in ways in which I think we've forgotten, and that's partly to highlight some of that. I'm going to speak about essentially about five things. One, the idea of a strategic partnership. That when Prime Minister Modi went there last year, he finally signed up on this so-called strategic partnership agreement. Many of you would wonder what is it that a large country like India and a city-state would have in common. But I think there's always been quite a bit that bound us together. But my sense is today, starting from first principles, Singapore is at the very heart of the Indo-Pacific, where the two oceans meet, where in the Malacca Straits, in the heart of it, Singapore sits there, essentially linking the two oceans. As India's own vision and sense of space expands to cover the Western Pacific, besides the Indian Ocean, I think Singapore naturally becomes a very important eastern anchor for India's larger look east policy, whatever you want to call it, both in the economic domain as well as in the strategic domain. Second, that within this linkage, Singapore has always talked about balance of power. Lee Kuan Yew, probably after Henry Kissinger, was one of the most affirmative exponent of the idea of balance of power. So as a result, Singapore often used to tweak our noses in the non-aligned movement when in the 80s and the 90s. There's always a problem dealing with mostly Tamil names, the guys who the foreign ministers of Singapore who challenged India's understanding of what was happening in Asia, whether it was on the Cambodian issue, whether it was on a range of things that were going on. But I think today India has moved from its old idealist rhetoric to one of seeing the world in more power terms. And I think that puts us, if we begin to think in balance of power terms, Singapore presents itself, I think, as a very important location for India's own long-term engagement with the shaping of Asian balance of power. Singapore is also a point, I think, from where, if you look at over the longer term, India's own sense of power projection into the Western Pacific takes place. We already have, for example, since '91, I think we have one of the longest maritime cooperations with Singapore. We have a defense cooperation agreement. I think the second iteration of it has come. We use the Changi base, our Navy uses it regularly. Their forces come here to Kalakunda base, right, near Calcutta. They use Devlali, right, for firing, they're using their artillery equipment. So in some senses, the natural connection between the two of us has begun to express itself. But this is just the beginning. I think my sense is that if you're talking about a strategic partnership, we're going to do a lot more. And my sense is the coming years, we will see a lot more beginning to happen between our two countries. Because as the waters of Asia become critical, when Asia is rising, when Asia's future economic prosperity depends upon securing its waters or securing its seas, we have precisely at that moment a greater conflict, greater tension in the maritime domain. And I think a stronger partnership with Singapore for India would be a critical component of structuring any kind of maritime security in the Indo-Pacific region, both in terms of bilaterally and through a range of multilateral institutions, whether it is IORA, whether it is the East Asia Summit, whether it is the ARF, whether it is the ADMM+. There are multiple institutions where actually India and Singapore today work together, and I think we'll have quite a bit of things to do in working together in shaping, in providing some security in this part of the world. There is also the question, I think, in terms of maritime domain awareness, a complicated word for a sense of, to understand what's going on in the seas, and in terms of greater exchange of intelligence, in terms of greater interoperability. There are a whole range of steps that we need to take. Hopefully, under the present leadership, the Defense Ministry is finally up to, our minister showed up for the first time in 8 years to speak at the Shangri-La conference, and hopefully there's going to be a lot more of a defense cooperation that's going to take place. So in some senses, the circumstances are going to drive us into, towards much more intensive defense cooperation, because the logic of balance of power for Singapore, the logic of a regional framing of security, and India's own approach as an important power in this region, I think are going to compel us to work together. That brings me to the third point. I mean, I think much of the thing we are seeing today is really the restoration of the past in some sense. I mean, it's never accurate, but it is really, if you think of the British Raj and see the relationship between India and Singapore, it's not very difficult to see why what's happening today is happening. That in some senses, geography is the destiny, that I think the expansive entity that the British India was, for British India, for British Raj, Singapore was really the eastern anchor, both in economic terms as well as in security terms. And the Singapore, of course, was part of India until 1867. I mean, administratively speaking, that the British Raj administered Singapore, Dending, Penang, and Malacca from Calcutta. In 1867, they were peeled off to become a separate state settlement. And the relationship, I mean, I think today, if you live in Singapore, suddenly you see there is, the whole memory of 19th century India and the British connection feels, we just have to go by the streets' names. Of course, in Delhi, we are kind of changing all the streets' names, but if you go there, you see Kitchener, you see, a whole lot of names, streets that are still around, which essentially many of these were civil servants, including Raffles, who founded Singapore, was a civil servant in the East India Company, and his own sense of what Singapore ought to be, a free trade entrepot, and a place from where the Raj can extend its power. So I think the core idea that existed before, in some senses, the expanding strategic cooperation today is really a restoration of that. That today, as India looks outwards, because the phase in which post-independence we've turned inwards, we disconnected ourselves consciously, deliberately, as a matter of strategy, turning our back from the regions which were actually, for whom security was provided by the Raj, into one of, in the name of non-alignment, in the name of a whole range of other things. We cut ourselves off. Today, I think the restoration of those strategic links under a different framework. Of course, all these countries are independent today. If you just have to read Panikar's Indian Ocean book, where he talks about, Singapore being a forward base for India. I mean, I think we don't use those terms anymore. Those days it was not too bad. But the fact is that it tells you a story that actually geography binds us together. That because we have shared values as well, because we are committed to balance of power, many of the things, the functions that Singapore performed for the Raj in the 19th century, right up to the 20th century, today we are trying to reconstitute that as independent sovereign states to reconstruct our cooperation, and I think this is just the beginning. The fourth point is on the economic side. Singapore's own formation, I think, and is very deeply connected to the origins of modern Indian capitalism, the Opium War and a range of things. I mean that as Singapore was the base from which India traded with China, that it became the point where the Indian and the Chinese interaction took place, not in terms of the ethnic population itself. For the Raj, it was a way station of connecting with southern China, and I think that linkage today, as India sees in a much broader terms today, that Singapore must necessarily become a point from where India's expansive economic interaction, much of it we're struggling to develop, partly because we're still stuck in a very, on trade issues, we're still stuck in an inward-looking mode. But if we see it in the long term, that Singapore would again become an economic entrepot for India, for a larger region in the world. And that brings me to the last point, which is also a cultural entrepot in a way. That those of you, I mean, some of these names are forgotten. A man called Kalidas Nag, who was an associate of Tagore, who was among the early associates of Tagore, who traveled with Tagore to China and to Japan. He writes very lyrically about his first visit to Singapore. I mean, I think this expansive sense of Singapore as a cultural unity, and because he was an Indologist and trained in France, and he saw the whole India's connections to Southeast Asia. That for them it was not merely a point where you traded opium or you moved stuff between India and China, but it was also a representation of historical interaction between the Indic world and the Sinic world. That there was this expansive interaction in this point, and I think today any long-term strategy of cultural regeneration of India's relationship with Asia in a general sense would involve Singapore. And the fact that the idea for the Nalanda University, it came from George Yeo of Singapore, essentially saying India is not an outsider to Singapore, of East Asia, that actually the Nalanda University from India was one of the oldest universities in the world, and that it connected a large part to Southeast Asia and to East Asia. So therefore, I think today when Singapore firms are involved in building a new capital city from where I come called Amaravati, the name itself is a very evocative one, there is that cultural dimension beyond the security, beyond the economic, that today we need to restore that. And I think there, again, I think Singapore, small though it is, can play a very important catalytical role in reconnecting us to the larger Asia. So let me conclude here by essentially saying that seeing the region as integrated way, in a geographic sense, in an economic sense, in a strategic sense, that the partnership between us is going to be, I think, the story that has just begun. It's still after a lot of stumbling, but my sense is that as we look outwards, as we look to the future, it's a, what is the line? I mean, it's a beautiful relationship that's going to be. Let me stop.
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks to all my panelists, guests here. Quite a few things have been said, very relevant and provoking me to ask some questions that might bring more insights into the relationship. Ambassador Saran, you talked about the narrowing of space, and Mr. Mohan, you also talked about how the water of Asia is going to become critical. In a certain sense, both are related areas of concern for both Singapore and India, and the need for greater cooperation. Do you see this issue can be either be used as a stronger catalyst or be a trigger for better relations, or what could be the challenges that will come in the way of using this as a a kind of a factor in bringing the two countries closer?
Raja mentioned the importance of balance of power in the manner in which Singapore looks at the region, and how he believes India has now begun to look at the region, although I believe India did look at the region in those terms, may have not articulated in those terms, but I think that was a very important factor right from the beginning. Nehru's Asian Relations Conference itself is, I think, a testimony to his sense of what role Asia would play in terms of India's own future, and that is why he focused on Asia to begin with. So, the balance of power aspect is very important. What I wanted to convey was that seen from the perspective of Singapore, its ability to maintain a degree of independence for itself, whether it is in terms of a relatively independent economic actor, in terms of having a sense of security in a rather contested geopolitical space, is dependent upon balance of power. And Singapore by itself is too small to be able to actually be an active participant in building of that balance of power. It will have to seek that in terms of its relationship with other major powers. And it has done a remarkable job in terms of maintaining a very positive relationship with all the major powers in the region. The reason why I think there is a degree of disquiet, not only in Singapore, but I perceive that with respect to other countries, for example in ASEAN, is because there is a transformation which is taking place in the region. Not that the United States of America is withdrawing from the region, but there is no doubt that there is a relative decline in terms of the preeminence which the United States enjoyed for many years after the Second World War. That situation is changing. It is changing because you have in this region a cluster of major powers. It's not only that China is rising and becoming relatively more dominant and relatively more assertive, but you have a Japan, which is by all indices is one of the major economic and military powers in the region. You have South Korea, which is not an insignificant power. You have ASEAN itself, which is somewhat weakened, but it is potentially an important power. You have on the other side Australia, you have in Indonesia, which could play a very important role, and yes, you have India. So, there is a potential for a much more diffused kind of a political order in the region, and with that diffusion comes uncertainty, unpredictability, because if you have that kind of a situation, theoretically at least, it is only through some kind of a more multipolar architecture that you can maintain the peace amongst the countries in the region, or you have a hegemon who maintains the peace in the region. I think we are at a stage where we are not quite certain which way things are going, because there is certainly, from my understanding of China, here is a country which does believe that traditionally it has been at the top of a hierarchical power structure, and that is where it belongs. If that is the perception which China has, it has accumulated a degree of economic and military capabilities, and believes that rather than participate in some kind of a shaping of a multilateral architecture, its interests are better served by that kind of a unilateral assertion of power, then we have a problem on our hands. And I think this is the origin of the disquiet that I am talking about. So far, you see, for example, with respect to ASEAN, my own sense has been that ASEAN has been very useful to the major powers, because it has provided some kind of a mediating platform amongst the major powers of the region. When ASEAN says, you must recognize the centrality of ASEAN, well, you are not really in that sense a central power, but I think it is very convenient for other powers to recognize that centrality, because by recognizing their centrality, you are creating a certain degree of a certain kind of a buffer zone amongst yourselves. So the points of confrontation, points of possible conflict are thereby sort of mitigated somewhat. Today you have China which is actually going and breaking up ASEAN. You know, what happened, for example, at the last meeting, where a certain statement was issued and then it was withdrawn. That, to me, seems to be a negative trend. And I'm not so sure how Singapore or how other countries in the region are really going to cope with this. And they certainly will be looking at how this balance of power, you know, concept, is this likely to work for them by the relationship that they have with India, with the United States, with Australia, the kind of, as I mentioned, the kind of a countervailing coalition which is crystallizing in the region. For Singapore, neither a confrontation amongst the major powers is in its interest, but nor is there, you know, if everybody was, if everybody had perfect convergence amongst one another, then Singapore's importance would also, to that extent, go down. But I think we are at a point where there is that kind of uncertainty. Why India-Singapore relations could be very important is because in the search for that kind of balance of power, which would retain the space for Singapore, which would retain the space for ASEAN, the kind of relationship, security relationship, which could be possible with India, which is expanding its own economic capabilities, its own military capabilities, I think that could be a very important part of the response to this new situation. What is good is that both for India as well as for Singapore, maintaining that space for the middle powers, the smaller powers in the region is in our common interest. Yes. And therefore, there is a certain platform on which we can actually work very closely.
Would you agree with this broad assessment?
I think Ambassador Saran has said most of it. I mean, I think the situation is fluid. The existing institutions, all of us would love to have ASEAN as the, you know, in the driver's seat. I don't know if it has the accelerator or the brakes these days, but I think the future, I don't think anyone is able to predict at this point of time. So I think this existing structure we hope will survive, but it needs to be supplemented by new forms of cooperation at a time when the balance of power in the region is being fundamentally altered by the rise of China and the emerging tensions between the major powers that's unfolding. So I think any framework involving a coalition, whether it's the middle powers, whether it is a network that some people are talking about today, that India-Japan, India-Singapore, Singapore-Japan, Singapore-Vietnam, a whole lot of supplementary agreements today.
So do you see India lacking the initiatives at this critical juncture? I mean,
no, I think my sense was that we've been slow on this. Though we, for example, our bilateral exercise with Singapore go back to now 20 years. It's been going on. But I think there was a period of hesitation, I would say, where we seemed unwilling to do things for the fear of China getting upset. But at this point, at least, there seems to be more openness to engage everyone. And not, that doesn't mean you pick a fight with the Chinese, but you're also engaging the Chinese. But I think there seems to be more openness, but it also would read a significant structural reform at home in how our defense ministry is organized, what you think of your overall security strategy. But those for the long term, but I would say there is a lot more desire and will, and that's partly when Prime Minister announces a strategic partnership with Singapore, or is willing to do things with Japan which the previous government was not willing to do, or when he goes to Mauritius where Ambassador Ambassador there stand next to a radar system and say, look, this is going to be India's part of a network of 46 Indian radars that India wants to set up in the Indian Ocean. You're talking about a new approach, but how much the system will translate that, that's interesting, but my sense is we are alive to that possibility.
Shahzad, I'll come to you with two specific questions with regard to economy and business. You talked about some disappointment with regard to taking the comprehensive economic cooperation agreement to the next stage. And you also talked about how maybe the business side is not that keen. Could it be, and this is an hypothesis, because the Indian industry and the banking system are going through a kind of stress which are naturally making it little defensive and therefore not forthcoming on agreeing to terms of trade or terms of openness or terms of standards which will, they fear, the Indian industry particularly and the banking system will make them more vulnerable to future shocks. I mean, it will be a tough medicine of sorts and they are not ready for it. So, is that a possible reason?
We went through the same experience in the 90s.
Yeah.
It's not as if when Mr. Narasimha Rao with Dr. Manmohan Singh in front, of course, and he was deep undercover, did the reforms and took the decisions to go ahead with these things. It's not as if industry was
industry was
applauding. Certainly in my boardroom in CII, there was immense conflict.
That's right.
And internal conflict, including threats of resignation from CII in case CII would go with the government on this liberalization path. So, that is not new. No industry anywhere in the world wants competition. Probably individually none of us want competition, probably it is human nature. So, we are not for competition, but I think you have to, at that time there was a force in the government which said, this is what is good for India, what is good for India, and industry found within 3 years after 91 we were up to 7% growth. What happened? Because trade and investment flowered and boomed, and then suddenly industry found, my gosh, this is good times have come, competition is not all that bad. So, all the people who were telling us to slow down and put the brakes on the government and all, and they all backed off because they were making more profit at that time. So, I think we must not be, country cannot be run by businessmen, and I have worked with businessmen for 50 years, but country cannot be run by businessmen, because they have certain commitment to their immediate, talked about privatization there, which led to a huge backlash on the government over here from the trade unions and the party. If that indiscretion had not happened, I think we would not be in the position we are today. We actually would have, Mr. Narasimha Rao and his team would have seen that somehow, we would have
moved in the direction,
handled the public sector reform in a different way. We are still, sorry?
My stealth.
By stealth. Everything is by stealth.
By stealth. The second question I would like to, you talked about how Singapore is the source of a lot of investments, and I must tell you that last financial year it was not Mauritius, it is Singapore which gave us the largest FDI flows. Now, and this is the development that is much after the book was conceived and planned, that the Mauritius Treaty has been changed. From your experience and from your understanding of the issues, how will India's relations with Singapore pan out in light of this Mauritius Treaty being changed, and will the Indian treaty with Singapore will have to be changed accordingly, and how India should really tackle this issue?
Okay, so, there are two parts to your question. I would say that the growth of investment from Singapore and through Singapore will continue to rise.
Okay.
I'm putting aside Mauritius for the time being. As long as we continue to make it easier for them to do business here, the processes, the offline complications of doing business in India, the corruption at the ground level, of getting land or getting your approvals on, those really trouble Singaporean businessmen very much.
Or removing discretion,
And removing discretion for it. So, this is, I have talked for so many Singaporean businessmen and they have had such problems. I mean, they have got approvals from the government of India, written approvals on which subsequently after they have invested have been changed with retrospective effect. So, you can't do that.
That doesn't work. Yeah,
I mean, you can't do that. We have tried to, engage the Commerce Ministry and talk to them and say you can't do this and all that, but no, we have changed the rule now. We have changed the rule because some lobby here, domestic lobby, doesn't want that competition from that Singaporean company here. We can't do, we are not a banana, we must not behave like a banana republic. Otherwise we will be called a banana republic and truly. So, I think investment will continue to grow. We must make it easier and more transparent. They are used to doing transparent business, online. They want to do it. They want to get their land online. They want to get the approvals online. If we can get to that stage, I think the sky is the limit for investment.
I mean, Mauritius Treaty.
I think the Mauritius Treaty will lead to a review of the Singapore Treaty. I think it will, because that's a logical thing, But I don't think it will impact the whole world likes to invest through Singapore, by the way. There was some element of the world who like to invest through Mauritius, who will be impacted. But I think around the world, there's a huge comfort level in dealing through Singapore. And Shyam talked about this idea of reinventing Singapore. To think that the Deputy Prime Minister Tharman Shanmugaratnam was put in charge of a task force as Deputy PM with a group to reinvent Singapore for the next, and that plan that they put together after the widespread national consultations, by the way, is on the website. Again, this is typical of them, the national strategy developed by a task force is on the website. They keep on doing this, they'll do it again, in the next 5 years. So, the whole system is different, and I think we need to buy into that system. It's good for us. I think Mauritius agreement will impact Singapore agreement, but it will not necessarily impact investments into India.
Okay, good. I think we have achieved the impossible. We began with a lot of optimism, and I think we have come to a point where we are slightly pessimistic about the relations between India and Singapore and how it can go forward, because there are many hurdles that we see. So, this is the right time, probably we should get the audience into this discussion. We have time for maybe 2 or 3 questions only, and we will have there is a mic here, and please identify yourself, and if you want to ask this question to a specific panel member, please go ahead.
I am Sagar, I run a media company, and I have 2 sons, they have studied in Singapore. And when they come and tell us, we are really bewildered by the way they conduct in the house and otherwise, and they say India is an unsafe place. Because when they come from Singapore, so my question is that what is, basically Chinese, there is a deep sort of a competition between the Indians and the Chinese, even between the students. And Indians are supposed to be good mathematicians, so they make an impact also. My question is, what is the too doubtful national, when they visit Singapore, they become, marvelous people. So is the place auspicious, or is the administration is absolute to its apex level? So how do you rate? And I'll tell you one thing, the institutes are absolutely the next generation institutes, and their conduct of business is absolutely not transparent only, it's absolute honest also.
Okay, I think Rajan, you have lived there. Mr. Das.
Why don't you, as chairman, answer the question? I think you should answer a question also.
Then what I would do is I will invite some more questions. Yeah. Let's have some more questions. Any more questions? Yeah.
Singapore,
from that. India should learn from the experience of Singapore regarding the utilization of its wastewater. Because from very little water availability per person, it has now reached a situation of meeting all its needs internally. So are we doing, is India doing anything, or have we already done some kind of agreement regarding this, learning some lessons from Singapore about utilizing its wastewater? Thank you.
I think it started with Dr. Kalam actually going to their facility as a president, and he brought that whole knowledge back. But our learning process is very slow. We have some disabilities in terms of learning and implementation.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. If there aren't any questions, I think your question that you raised is actually was addressed in some way, in a different way, by Mr. Das, how the cultural issues are at play. Largely, it's a cultural issue, and I think unless we sort of make that attempt at bringing about a cultural transformation, which is not a short-term project, it's a long-term project, and I think that will be the way forward.
I would just like to make a point that I think we shouldn't take this comparison too far. Singapore is a city-state. Things can be handled much more efficiently, perhaps with a degree of focus. That is simply not possible in a country of India's size. So yes, I think there are lessons that we need to learn from Singapore, and those lessons are very important. The fact that there is a continual search for excellence is something which holds lessons for India. But I think before we sort of make this comparison as if this is all shining bright and this is all
self-flagellation.
I think there needs to be I'm not using it as an excuse for India, but I'm saying that I think we have to recognize that we are a continental size country and with a very large population. We are a very diverse country. We have, you have 20 satellites going up into orbit, and you have also poverty of the most bewildering kind in this country. But the fact is that democracy, the plurality that we have, the size we have, imposes a certain degree of constraint, which perhaps is difficult for people to understand. So the comparison in terms of what lessons we can learn from what successes Singapore has achieved, yes, but I think there should be a certain awareness that our situation is not quite the same as a city-state.
Okay. Before we conclude, I just wanted to ask one question to all my fellow panelists, which is about the asymmetrical relationship between India and Singapore, which Ambassador Saran has written about in this thing. And my question is that what could be the dangers of this asymmetry, and what should India and as well as Singapore be wary of in forging the relationship in spite of those asymmetries?
So, look, I think asymmetry in itself is not a problem. The advantage of Singapore is its location and a coherent, purposeful state, a city-state. And its location then at the center of the Indo-Pacific, sitting astride the Malacca Straits, gives it a unique position. And I think how you take advantage of that, I mean, that's all. I mean, I don't think it's a problem. Most of it is on our side in terms of how do we take full advantage of the opportunities that Singapore offers, one, on the economic side to anyone who comes there, On the security side, I think we've had a far more preferential engagement over the last many years. The question for us, I would say at this point is, are we taking full advantage of what Singapore has to offer? The public, Indian middle class is taking advantage, but I don't know if the Indian government is taking full advantage. I mean, there is a problem, but my sense is that asymmetry in itself is not the issue, but that is always there. World is not made up of equals. That therefore, the question is, what is it that we can give and take? I mean, I think while Singapore is small, there are things, for example, you raised the question of water. Today, water management is a big urban issue. I mean, I think today, whether it is the large European countries or Singapore, everyone is willing to offer, because it's not rocket science, the rest of the world has dealt with these issues. So there are things you can learn from different people. I mean, in terms of urban mobility issues or in terms of tax administration. After all, Singapore, when it was set up in '65, came to advise for Air India to understand how to set up Singapore Airlines. I've heard Lee Kuan Yew say, at the end of the Second World War, India had the best universities in Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras. In some senses, look, I think we didn't fully use those advantages. But today, as you look outwards, Singapore has a particular niche in our overall thing. That's not the only relationship. And our problems with Singapore are generally manifest in all our relationships. It's not just exclusive to Singapore. That internally, are we fully prepared to deal with a world that is more open to us today? So that is the issue. And there, I think I would say the fault, dear Brutus, is in ourselves.
No, but let me add to my earlier question and ask you that the question that came up as that, why is it that in Singapore things are done so well, everything is fine, everything is online and is handled beautifully, and Ambassador Saran talked about that, the two should not be compared. Now that thing is often not recognized. So isn't that one danger of asymmetrical relationship?
I think I want to refer to when Chandrababu Naidu wanted a new capital, and he turned to Singapore, and Singapore responded positively. Singapore government, I presume at the level of the Prime Minister, appointed a special envoy for Andhra Pradesh. A special envoy for Andhra Pradesh to monitor the implementation of this work. Basically to see that implementation was done. I joked at that time with the special envoy that with the flood of chief ministers going to Singapore every month, supposedly for learning and investment promotion, not only for shopping and tourism, you may need to appoint many more special envoys for different states of India. And he made a very important point. He said, we don't have the capacity. We are too small. We are a city state. Actually said exactly what Shyam is saying. He said, we don't have, we handled Andhra Pradesh. If something specific and big comes, one or two things we can do, but we are a small country. We cannot cope with too much. So there is that asymmetry very much there, and we must not have over expectation of what they can do. But still within that my A to Z, there are different institutions we can tap into in Singapore for collaboration and partnership. That is what I would think. But we should be, and on our side, I think we are neglecting the management and implementation of programs and projects and all that. I think it's not only projects, it's excessive borrowings and all. I think somewhere down the line, I always find there is a weakness in management. Okay. I'm not talking necessarily of government only. I think including the private sector. There is a weakness of management.
Mr. Saran, I'll let you have the last word.
I think the point that has been made is very important, that there are lessons to be learned And I think we should, like for example, dealing with wastewater or solid waste management. I mean, Singapore's experience in that field also has been very, very remarkable. Still, the problem for India will remain, how do you scale up that experience? So, whether it is innovation that is actually available within our country, and you'd be amazed how much innovation is taking place in this country itself. The challenge for us has always been not that we don't know what the solutions are, or there are not enough creative people in India and abroad, including in Singapore, who have come up with solutions to very, very important challenges that we face. But still for India, given its size, given its population, the scale on which we operate, how do we scale that up? And that challenge, Singapore cannot solve for you. This is a challenge you have to solve yourself.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can we construct processes, can we construct institutions which will allow us to scale up these kind of difference to our economic prospects, starts making a difference to the lives of our ordinary people. That, I am afraid, nobody else can do for us. That's something.
Excellent. I think we have maybe one last question. Maybe I think we're running out of time.
Mr. C. Rajamohan, you mentioned after Henry Kissinger, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew was the most important figure in balance of power. And recently I've read a book about by leading Indian columnist Mr. Suranda K. Dattare about Lee Kuan Yew and the very fascinating story about the Singapore's growth story, which is titled Looking East to Look West, if I'm not wrong. Do you think Singapore can really be a good ally for us, and in what way? If India really wants to act east, and in terms of strategically, I mean not economically, just strategically, how can India be a great ally for Singapore if India needs to reach out to the other nations in the Southeast region?
Look, I think, as I said, the problem is not the lack of interest in Singapore. The problem has been from our side. I think it's Woody Allen who said 90% of success in life is just to show up. Our defense minister has taken 8 years to show up at a Shangri-La dialogue, where in one hotel you can meet most of the Asian defense ministers. So I think the problem is, if we are serious about raising our presence and role on the military strategic side, Singapore is open for cooperation. I mean, I think they've made it very clear they want to engage. In fact, last 3 years they've been saying, look, they wanted Manmohan Singh to come, because every year there is a prime minister speaking at the Shangri-La conference. They wanted Manmohan Singh to come, but he didn't make it. They were hoping Mr. Modi will make it in the last 2 years. Maybe he can the next year. That, look, it's not just Singapore. Look, whole of East Asia today, the Philippines, Singapore, Vietnam, everyone wants to do more defense cooperation with us. So it's a problem has been our incapacity to organize ourselves, to be able to respond to the kind of demands that are being raised. And it's not as if they love us, that's why they want defense cooperation. Because everyone is trying to diversify their security cooperation. China is rising. The question of credibility of the American power are being raised. So everyone is trying to take insurance, and they want India to be part of that security insurance. It is really up to us to respond to those demands, the growing demand for security in the region, and the question is, how can we do it? The point is, I said again, historically, Indian Army was the security provider in this part of the world for 150 years. There was an Indian garrison. Singapore was blessed with 2 Indian armies, not just one. There was the Subhash Chandra Bose army that came in with the Japanese, and there was the Indian army went back to restore the garrison. So, and you have memorials for both. I mean, that is the very special nature of Singapore. That there is this connection out there, which it's up to us to use.
I think we have come to the end of this short discussion on the book. The final the message that I get from this discussion is that Singapore offers a lot of opportunities, but to gain full advantage from that relationship, I think the ball is in India's court. These words, we thank you once again to the panelists, and thank you very much.